Good morning, everybody. It is so great to be here. Thank you so much, Lauren and Fred, and it's an honor to share the stage of Ataya with you, and the work that you're doing is just fantastic. Just great to see this packed room here with this kind of interest. I got to say, there's something that kind of ties the early part of my career with this event here today. I used to teach middle school science. And one of the most exciting set of classes for the students was trying to understand what happens to their poop. So full circle, back here with the experts. It's great to be here, and it's wonderful, again, to be part of NEWEA's conversation. And one of the things that I always think of when I speak in New England, which is often, you'll see, I'm going to take you on a trip with me in the last year, is to just always acknowledge that we are on the ancestral lands of Native Americans who were here well before colonialism happened, and there was a long, long tradition, generation upon generation, of land and water and air stewardship. And I like to think that those of us in this room are trying to continue that mission, that goal to protect the earth and protect all the resources. So I think that's an important thing for us to know and think about how we stand on those kinds of shoulders. I am about to be approaching my one-year anniversary as the EPA Regional Administrator, early February. It's been an incredibly exciting year, one in which I am just filled with so much gratitude for the partnerships with organizations like yours, the expertise and professionals that is just such a pleasure to work with, and the states, municipalities, tribes with whom we collaborate and partner to solve some of the most pressing environmental and justice issues of our time. And I gotta say, one of the most important things that I'm grateful for is the incredible staff at EPA. And I certainly worked with them when I was in state government, but of course never got to know the depth of their expertise and devotion, creativity, and innovation. I just want to take a moment. If you work at EPA, either in the region or at headquarters, can you raise your hand and let's just give a huge round of applause. Raise it high. Thank you. Dedicated public servants. So yes, today, and this conference is one in which we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And as Fred noted, a job well done. There's no question that water is in much better shape all across the country than it was 50 years ago. And I would add a little addendum to that, because while it's important to celebrate and pat ourselves on the back, it's really important to know that there is still more to do. So I don't know if by the end of the conference you can add that to the little thing here, just a job well done, but more to do. That's something that we're all working on. That's why we're here, to learn how to do that job better. And this is an extraordinary time as we celebrate the Clean Water Act to also be embracing the priorities of the Biden-Harris administration, which are issues that I'm going to talk about that have been fundamental in the environmental movement, in the environmental justice movement, but are really getting a center stage presentation now with the Biden-Harris administration, and especially with EPA Administrator Michael Regan. And of course, these two main priorities are trying to understand how we can address climate change, already an urgent crisis, but also rife with opportunities, but also how do we get to a place where environmental protection and environmental justice are one and the same. And let me take on that first issue, environmental justice. So I don't know if you've had a chance while you've been in Boston, but to walk over to the Common and see the new Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King memorial called The Embrace. I walked by there this morning. I got out of the tea this morning. You know, it was gray, drizzling morning, and it's the first time I've been there. I wasn't there at the unveiling last week, but just remarkable. Just a remarkable testament to the power of love and justice to make people's lives better. And Administrator Regan, on the anniversary of MLK Day, said the following. He said, "I often think about Dr. King's evolution during his time on Earth, and I find myself wondering how he might have continued to evolve if given the chance. Dr. King began to expand his vision of what it meant to achieve a truly just society before paying the ultimate price for his beliefs. And although the environmental justice movement began nearly 2 decades after his death, the core values of the movement undeniably align with Dr. King's teaching and actions." In a separate address, Administrator Regan said, "No community should ever experience what Flint experienced. No community should ever experience what Jackson, Mississippi is experiencing right now. We have to have a proactive strategy to prevent cities from getting to that point. These are the communities that are most at risk from a health standpoint. These are the communities also that have suffered from a lack of investment and indifference. And so we want to put those who need these resources the most at the front of the line. As we are rebuilding water infrastructure, we're also rebuilding trust with communities." And that notion, which he also talks about the effort to get environmental justice into the DNA of EPA, I think is a command to us that drives all that we're doing right now. Not easy, incredibly challenging to take a large bureaucratic agency like the EPA and have it so well attuned to communities and the needs of communities to make the investments to avoid the Flints and the Jacksons. So that's one of the main priorities. The second, obviously, is climate change. Urgent crisis. We see the problems happening all over, and water plays a central role in this, whether you're looking at the storms in California now or the hurricanes that have battered Puerto Rico and Texas and Florida and are getting worse and worse and worse. And we also see huge opportunities. We see green tech economy, blue tech economy growing in ways that we haven't in decades and decades or ever. So now is the time that we should be seeking the kind of workforce development and job growth development, and precisely in those communities that I was just talking about. If we can get workforce development in the low-income communities, in the black and brown communities that have been burdened by pollution, water pollution, air pollution, cumulative impacts of all of these, we will be seen as having seized this important opportunity, and we cannot let that go by. And of course, as we're trying to weave environmental justice into the DNA of the EPA, and I'm going to talk about this in some detail, we could see how both of those things intersect with water policy, with how we do our permitting. So for example, we just recently last fall announced that under our Clean Water Act authority, we are taking the residual designation authority and in this case, in the largest set of watersheds that has ever been done with residual designation, in the Mystic, Neponset, and Charles watersheds, all that feed into Boston Harbor. And we've done a phenomenal job. As Fred was saying, we have a lot to celebrate that over the last 50 years, we've done so much to clean up Boston Harbor and those 3 rivers by improving our wastewater treatment facilities, et cetera. But we're not getting at stormwater. And in fact, the stormwater problems that we're seeing in those watersheds affect low-income communities and communities of color throughout the Boston metro area. So that's one big step. And our whole analysis and drafting of that step forward was about how do we bring climate change, increasing storm events, et cetera, and environmental justice into that. The second was a set of NIPD's permits that we did in Chelsea recently, again, for the first time and in a much greater extent, bringing environmental justice and climate change into the drafting of the permits themselves in a way that we've understood for decades that the water system is not static, it's dynamic, and that's how we should be permitting. So big shout out. I see Ken Moraff here, the director of our water office in Region 1. He and his team have been working tirelessly on these kind of innovations and creativity. Great job, Ken, and the rest of your team. The third big priority in the Biden-Harris administration, pushed by a Congress that saw that investments are so important, is the work that we're going to be doing with the bipartisan infrastructure law implementation passed a year ago November, and now the Inflation Reduction Act. Those two bills invest in EPA to invest in states and cities and the private sector over $100 billion. $60 billion from the infrastructure bill and another $40+ billion from the Inflation Reduction Act. $500 million of that just this year in New England has been invested in wastewater treatment facilities and other infrastructure, in the removing of lead pipes, et cetera. $100 million going to deal with emerging contaminants like PFAS. Huge, huge opportunity, an opportunity that we all in this room have not lived through in the past because there's never been this kind of investment. And I just want to give another shout out to another EPA employee, Leslie Corcelli. Corcelli is here, sitting in the back. Raise your hand because she's going to be, she'll be doing a panel tomorrow in which you can learn more of the details of infrastructure funding. The fourth big priority after investment is something that Ifatayo mentioned too, which is workforce development. We all know, especially with all of this funding coming, how important it's going to be to staff up and how important it's going to be to diversify that staff, to make sure that the staff of municipal and state water offices and agencies represent the communities that they serve. And that's something that we're working on. We're really excited. We've hired 70 new staff in the last year, probably 100 more in the region, and that's just remarkable to be staffing up in such a way to serve our constituents. So those are the four big priorities. And what I want to do now is take you on a tour through my first year. I've had the honor and the pleasure to travel all over New England. It's really important for me to get out of Boston to understand how communities and states and NGOs and the private sector are, the struggles that they have and the opportunities that we have to work together. So I'm gonna take you on this tour, site by site. Well, these aren't the only sites, but these are the ones that illuminate the kind of work that we do with NEWEA. So I think these should resonate with all of you. So my first was in Saco, Maine. This was actually in my first week. I'm not sure Howard Carter is in that photo there, but he should be. He's in there. And this was, again, my first week here. The administrator came up from Washington to talk about the infrastructure bill. And again, here we see this kind of intersection, of climate and... Oh, there's. Thank you, Howard. Thank you, Howard. This was not planned. This example was a perfect illustration of the intersection of where you have a town that has been challenged by its wastewater treatment infrastructure, that it is going to be inundated by tidal sea level rise, storm surges because of climate change, and we have to figure out how do we invest in these kinds of infrastructure in a way that will protect cities and towns. And this is a perfect example of that. And I believe it was just announced last week. Remind me how much was announced moving forward?
Last week we picked up $5 million, and the year before that we picked up $3.9 million.
Yeah, so $8 to $9 million to start addressing this problem. And this is just one of those. It was such a pleasure to be in Saco and be with the administrator and local leaders, et cetera, and of course the folks on the ground. That's where the action happens. All right, the next part of my travels was to the Passamaquoddy tribe in northern Maine. They've been struggling with a wastewater treatment facility that's basically, I think it's like 5 to 10 feet above sea level. This was at a tribal meeting with our staff as we were focusing on many different intersecting issues, but this was one where they're going to be getting, again, about between $5 and $10 million to study the moving of this wastewater treatment facility so that it could best accommodate what's going to be happening on the shores and to better serve the community. Okay, the next trip was in Milton, Vermont, and this was at a mobile home community that has suffered under repeated flooding, boil water orders, And we toured the community to see if we could understand how EPA could best help, how Vermont could best help as well. And this is a very interesting because, and I want to be kind of really clear about this, when we talk about environmental justice, I think what people often think is, how do we deal with urban issues, with issues in cities? And no, it's not just about that. It can't be just about that, because there are communities like this one that have been overburdened. I mean, that's the definition, is about being overburdened, about bearing too much of environmental insults over years, not having a seat at the table. And certainly a community like this community, that's what they've experienced. Odd laws in all of our states about how they're connected with municipal systems and not. So these are the kind of communities that's very important to sit down with and try to understand with our state and municipal partners, how can we best serve the needs of these communities to have clean water in a way that we have in many, many parts of the region. Nearby, Lake Champlain, I've had a couple of events up there. I think, as many of you know, particularly from up there, Senator Patrick Leahy was a huge champion of protecting Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain is one of those what we call GEO programs, where the federal government invests large sums of money to work with the surrounding states, cities, and towns to try to solve a major water problem. And this was one where there's a lot of algae blooming. It's sparked more or catalyzed more by temperature changes. And so this was an example where our deputy administrator, Janet McCabe, I'm not sure you could read that, came up, and we were announcing $40 million coming from Congress, again, part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, to start addressing some of these kinds of issues. So really important to understand the intersection of agriculture, that's urban development in Burlington, et cetera, in solving those kinds of problems. The next place was Waterbury, Vermont, and I will say I was in Waterbury, Connecticut that morning for an event, and then went up to Waterbury, Vermont, and I'm not going to choose which was. Most people thought, like, oh, why are you going to Waterbury twice? But we were there to celebrate an award that they had won from EPA on really innovative ways that they've been developing their engineering there. And I think, Bob, you were there. That's right. That was a great event. Bob Fisher was there. Just, again, remarkable. When we can make the investments, we'll see the kind of creativity and innovation that will provide clean water for families and communities and lower costs as well. The next place is Dover, New Hampshire. Lot of interesting activities are happening in the Great Bay Area, also plagued by stormwater. Really innovative partnerships between EPA, the state, and these municipalities that are working together, and real innovation in terms of the technologies, green technologies that are being used. This was an example. I spent a couple of hours there where we toured Dover and met with the University of New Hampshire folks who'd been doing some work, and of course with those folks on the ground. And I don't know how many know Bill Boulanger, who, it was just fantastic to talk to him. I don't know, are you here, Bill? I don't know, okay. Just fantastic, because as many of you, he struggles with all of the demands of a municipal public works person, and then requirements from the EPA and requirements from the state. He very lovingly called MS4 permits more shit for us. But his key point, lovingly, he said that, his key point was how important it is to understand what's happening on the ground. Really interesting back and forth between him and the faculty member from UNH, where, yeah, on the desktop, this kind of technology might work, but wait, when you get a crew of DPW folks who know how to use backhoes and know, the terrain in a really important way, maybe the technology and the engineering should be done totally differently. And having those two at the table as Dover went through this process of making these investments was pretty remarkable to watch. So that was, oops, sorry, I didn't show the more close-up picture there. So we're standing in a swale that captures runoff during storm events in a way that they've now shown, has blocked flooding from happening in residential areas and near a school. This was right next to a school. Okay, so that was Great Bay. Portsmouth, New Hampshire. This was pretty remarkable day. So this was, there's Senator Shaheen and the mayor of Portsmouth, and maybe even more importantly, Andrea Amico is the woman over here in black. A mother who, when PFAS first started emerging as a problem years ago, became very activated and galvanized the community to raise its concerns, worked with her state representatives, worked with the city, worked with the EPA, worked with the Department of Defense to really push for that right that's ensconced in the Clean Water Act, that she should be able to turn on the tap in her house and not worry what her kids are drinking. Fundamental right that's part of the Clean Water Act, and that's not what happened with her. And so she, as an advocate, she pushed the powers that be to make changes. And Pease Air Force Base, this is on Pease Air Force Base, which was contaminating local wells, started incredible investments in innovative technology. We were learning about different filter systems here, which I could not even begin to describe to you. You could describe to me, I'm sure, but has addressed the problem, not fully, not 100%, but in a way that she was able to stand with us and look forward to the next steps that we're all going to be taking as we move forward in the next 50 years with the more that we have to do. So that was a pretty remarkable visit there. Merrimack, Fred mentioned the Merrimack River. Also during my first week, visited up in Lowell at the wastewater treatment plant there, and with Congresswoman Trahan, looking at the various challenges that are focused there. Yes, major improvements on the Merrimack, still a lot to go. And we were also announcing there chunks of the bipartisan infrastructure law and how those were going to go towards solving a whole range of problems on the Merrimack. And that's an example, cutting through two states where states have to work together, EPA has to work together, X number of cities and towns have to work together to solve that problem. Oh, sorry, I didn't advance fast enough there. So many of you have seen it. Old mill towns all along the Merrimack, as is the case in so many rivers in New England. Okay, so a couple of fun activities in Boston. So in October, we had a big event in East Boston in which this park that you see here 10 years ago was basically an industrial wasteland. And through state and federal funding, that's been turned into a beautiful park. It's within a short walking distance to 2 elementary schools. This is also a generally underserved community. There's a boathouse that's just off the picture here. And what's pretty amazing about that is through a variety of different funding sources, that boathouse now acts as an educational center for these elementary school students. On the day we were there, 80 students came over. We had Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and Mayor Wu there, who, by the way, talk about rock stars. It was just amazing to watch these kids flock to both of these public servants and ask for autographs, literally asking them for autographs. They ignored me, understandably, totally understandably. And this is, when you talk about the Clean Water Act, those kids would not have this opportunity were it not for the Clean Water Act. Not only would this industrial wasteland not have been cleaned up, and it wouldn't have been cleaned up because the harbor still would have been despoiled. It still would have been, for those of you old enough to know, as Fred mentioned, you couldn't go in that water. I have a brother-in-law who fell in the Charles water in the 80s and had to go to the hospital and get all kinds of antibiotics, and that was routine. Don't go to the water, the parents told their kids. That's not the case anymore. These kids are learning sailing, they're learning sustainability, they're learning climate change at this amazing spot. What was great about this is the Assistant Administrator for Water, Radhika Fox, joined us for this, and let's see if we can do this. Then we took a tour of Boston Harbor to show, to highlight to her, we had many of the folks who had been instrumental in cleaning up the harbor. I think I see at least 2 here. Fred Lasky was with us, and John Sullivan, is that you in the back? John Sullivan was with us on the boat, and so I think, as many of you know, part of the standards in the Clean Water Act is trying to make it fishable, waters fishable and swimmable. Okay, let's see if this can work here.
So hi, I'm Radhika Fox, the Assistant Administrator for Water at the EPA, here with David Cash, our Region 1 Administrator, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act and how the Boston Harbor is now fishable and swimmable. So David, what do you say? You gonna take a swim?
Absolutely. If it's swimmable, I'm swimming in it.
Woo!
All right, let's go. And it was just fantastic to have some of these folks who were, at the beginning of the cleanup of Boston Harbor. Vivian Lee was with us. Those of you may know her, just a champion of economic development and environmental justice. It was pretty remarkable to celebrate that way, and the water was beautiful. All right, another water-related event, also early in my term, was the lower Neponset River, the last 3.7 miles of which was finally designated on the Superfund list. This is an urban river which, for many people in the communities that abut it, they didn't even know there was a river there. There were walls, there were fences. It was so highly polluted from PCBs of the, not decades, but centuries of industrial development along the Neponset, which was so important for the economic development of Boston and New England. We know that. And we also know it's time to kind of make right the wrongs from the past. And so just, again, Ayanna Pressley was at this event, Mayor Wu, Congressman Lynch, Senator Warren was there, local state representatives, community activists who had pushed and pushed and pushed and are now going to help as we do all of the work that needs to get done to make this. Whether it will be fishable and swimmable, I don't know, but man, that's the goal. And if before then we can make it boatable, which it already is in many spots, and nice parks and accessible, then we will have succeeded. I'm just looking at the time here. Okay, good, we're good. So here was another event down at the Woonasquatucket River with Senator Reed, where we were giving out Healthy Communities grants to local communities that were trying to work to, again, make the river, which had been industrially polluted for decades and decades, more accessible with things like river walks, parks, all of these kinds of things, and be an engine for economic development and workforce development in that area. This was an event down in Fall River where we were combining federal funding events. We were investing in electric school buses because just like Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act should make it possible and give a right to parents to stand on a corner while the school bus arrives and not worry what their kids are breathing in. So really excited, $5 billion in the infrastructure law to replace diesel buses with electric school buses. We were also there because of a lead service line funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law. So I got to watch them pull out an old lead line, pull in a new clean line. Really exciting event. What you can't see here, but as we're working, there's a mom and her son, toddler, looking. Of course, he's most excited about the big earth-moving machines that are doing really cool things. But what I imagine she was thinking is, I don't have to worry anymore. I'm not going to have to worry when I fill up a glass of water for my kid anymore. I'm not going to have to worry that there'll be some decrease in my kid's IQ numbers over years. I'm not going to have to worry about behavioral problems of my kid anymore. That's a pretty remarkable thing. And it was pretty amazing to talk to the folks who'd been working out on this cold day to talk to them about that's what this work was all about. That's what the Clean Water Act is about. That's what a celebration of a Clean Water Act 50th anniversary is, that we give peace of mind to that family in a way that they probably haven't had because they knew they had lead pipes. So this was a pretty remarkable event for me to participate in. This next event was down on Cape Cod. We give out a variety of different monitoring grants to cities and towns in New England. This was $250-something thousand for them to monitor the beaches there so they could give warning if there are problems with stormwater issues or any problems with wastewater issues that might mean they have to close the beaches. Again, partnership, 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 city, town, state, Department of Public Health, Department of Environmental Protection, just phenomenal event down there as well. In Connecticut, so this is again a Superfund site in Durham, Connecticut, where this was finally at the end of several decades and about $40 million of investment from the federal government of basically changing out infrastructure and getting new wells, getting this Durham off of this service and connecting to a neighboring town's service. Delicate negotiation between the two cities, but again, lots of efforts made by the federal government, state government, and activism. Again, there was a mother there with two of her children 4 or so years ago when that kid was like 9 years old. They testified, the kid testified, and I've seen the video of it. It's just remarkable, this kid in her pajamas, because it was a late night hearing at the local town, comes up to the microphone and talks about how she doesn't want to have to worry about the water she drinks. What could be more fundamental than that? A 9-year-old in her pajamas, and they were there. So it was great to kind of celebrate the completion of that. And then let me just finish up with this is like Lake Champlain, Long Island Sound is one of these large geographic programs. There's another $106 million of funding coming to this over the next couple of years, in addition to what they've already been getting. And again, this is money that will be dispersed through cities and towns, not just right there on the town. We did an event in Brockton, Massachusetts, so I don't know, that's 50 miles away from the Sound, because the streams there obviously eventually enter into the Long Island Sound. So really important that these kind of investments are made where the impacts are going to happen to protect the resources that we so dearly care about. So why don't I want to wrap up and give time for a couple of minutes for questions. So we're at this turning point. 50th anniversary, we should celebrate. So much has changed. We don't have rivers that catch on fire anymore. We don't have the Nashua River, which was bright red. I've seen pictures of the Nashua River being bright red. We don't have a Boston Harbor that's as polluted as it was 50 years ago. And yet, we still have communities that suffer because their infrastructure is not as good as it should be. And we know that those are the same communities that are overburdened by air pollution, same communities that turnpikes drive through, same communities that have an unfair amount of manufacturing facilities, energy facilities. They're the same communities. And it's those in the next 50 years of the Clean Water Act, in the face of increasing storms and unpredictability of the weather, rising sea levels, that we have to focus the resources of the Clean Water Act. That's the regulatory resources, the financial resources, the expertise that's in this room, all of whom of you are partners with us, partners with our state partners and city partners. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions.